If you can't look ahead in a program and mathematically see how the stress is going to improve over time or where the periods of recovery are, that means there's something wrong with the program. What's going on, guys? It's Bromley from Empire Barbell. Real quick, I'm trying to grow this channel as much as I can. The greater my subscriber base, that means the more time and effort I can dedicate to putting out videos. I have a goal of putting out 3 to 4 every week. So go ahead and hit the subscribe button and the notification bell to make sure you don't miss out, because trust me, you don't want to play catch up. I appreciate everybody's support. You guys have been awesome so far. Today we're going to talk about some of the most important things about your programming. Now, this is a very conceptual discussion for any of you who are writing out your own programs or following somebody else's. Hopefully this will help you connect some dots with regards to what you should be experiencing at each phase of your program. So the important thing to start out with is that the workout is not the program. This is where a lot of people mess up. The point of training, the point of getting a workout, is to subject yourself to a novel stress or some stressor that is greater or more substantial than what you've experienced before, and that causes an adaptive response. We look at the SRA cycle over here, where you incur a stress, you take time to recover, and then your body responds by causing an adaptation that makes you more resilient to that stress in the future. Remember, though, that the point of the adaptive response is to insulate you to that stress. The point of it is so that next time you experience that stress, it's not going to be as substantial, it's not going to affect you as much. So it is our responsibility, by using intelligent programming, to make sure that we are always one step ahead of the adaptive cycle, so that we don't end up in a cycle of stagnation doing the same work that our body has already adapted to. Now, anybody can get off the couch and go do a workout that makes them hurt or makes them sore or causes some short-term stress. But what happens with every new trainee is they get in the habit of just going in and working harder and harder and harder, keeping their fingers crossed and hoping that next time they come back stronger. Obviously, that's not sustainable. Most of you watching this should have experienced that at some point already. So what do we do? How do we get around it? Well, let's start by looking at the most simple, straightforward iteration of programming, and that's a linear progression. Just like starting strength, strong lifts, Grayscale LP, you essentially keep sets and reps static, use the exact same movements, and all you do is add 5 pounds each time. It's the same workout every workout of your life, just with marginally more weight. Now, when you're newer, this actually tends to work pretty well, because when you're new, these SRA cycles are very short. They only last a few days, which means if you're squatting every 3 days, you can come back and revisit that cycle. The extra 5 to 10 pounds is enough stress to cause further growth, and the 2 to 3 days in between workouts is enough time to actually recover. So you can run it indefinitely. And we know that programs like this have successfully gotten guys to 400-pound plus squats, 300+ pound bench presses, and people have been able to run it months and months at a time without having to reset or change programs. Now the question is, if it's good enough to get to that intermediate level of strength, why isn't it good enough to take you to an 800-pound squat, to a 500-pound bench press? Well, the reason is because of stagnation and recovery issues. Remember, I said you're doing the exact same workout every single time. So even though you're adding a little bit of weight, that extra weight stops being so substantial, it stops being such a huge stimulus as to cause you to keep growing. It doesn't give your body enough of a reason to adapt. The diminished returns really mute the effect of those jumps. Also, the amount of stress you need to spark that adaptive response as you get stronger has to be greater and greater, or at least it has to be substantially different than what you've been doing. This mandates a much longer period of recovery. As you get stronger, and this is universal, you have to space out your hard attempts, specifically your hard similar attempts, further and further apart. And that's a problem with these programs the way they're written, because eventually that becomes unsustainable. You don't recover in between each workout and you stop getting stronger. Now, the practical programming universe, which concerns itself pretty much entirely with linear progressions, recommends a move to something like the Texas method, where it's once a week as opposed to a few times a week, and then eventually there's iterations that go every other week and every 3 weeks. 3-week waves like 5-3-1 are very common because they work with such a wide variety of people. Getting to intermediate levels of strength is very easy, just about everything works. We like these because they're very easy to program, gives you a lot of practice with foundational barbell movements, and they're very predictable. Something like 5-3-1, you're going 3 weeks on an aggressive progression and then dropping back, increasing those 3 weeks just by 5 or 10 pounds and repeating. So it's essentially linear progression with extra steps. So instead of every workout, it's every 3 weeks, and we go from 85 to 90 to 95%, and then repeat just marginally heavier. Well, each week represents a varied threshold. And when you're starting out something like 5-3-1, you know that the AMRAP goes like 12 or 13 reps on week 1, 8 reps on week 2, maybe 4 or 5 reps on week 3. So it's a pretty big spread of training thresholds. That variety allows you to recover from the threshold you trained before, because remember, similar efforts are the ones that take longer to recover from. Now, a downfall of these linear progression type programs is that they're monotonous and they move very slowly. Each pocket of training only progresses 5 or 10 pounds at a time, and you'll notice a pattern that as you take those workouts further and further apart, you're still living for the same 5-pound jump, just over a much longer span of training. So this is the reason why so many good lifters do something that has a periodized element to it. So let's look at block periodization. Now, don't trip out over the terminology. Block periodization just means we're doing 3 to 4 weeks of training in one threshold and then moving to another threshold. It's essentially an abbreviated version of a linear periodization scheme. Linear periodization schemes start with very light weight, a ton of work, and then they just reverse over time. So going into the meet, you're only doing a few sets and reps at very, very heavy weight. They used to run months and months. If you did 2 contests a year, that was 2 linear periodization cycles. Eventually, they found out that if you compress them and condense them into smaller units, it was actually much more effective. So now instead of spending 8 or 12 weeks in a volume phase, you might spend 3 or 4 weeks in a volume phase. And then you might run through several full cycles before you actually have a meet. So that's really all we're talking about with block periodization. It's just the idea of blocking off different thresholds. It's a way of taking a period of training and making it more discrete. So we can hyperfixate on one quality instead of having this long blended periodization scheme where the changes are very kind of unnoticeable because you're making them so small and so continuously. So with block periodization, we're addressing these issues of stagnation and recovery. So to start off this SRA curve, it's no longer workout to workout. We're no longer in a period where we fully recover in the amount of time that occurs between our last workout and our next workout. So instead, we look at the SRA curve over a period of sessions, because in something like, let's say, a volume or a hypertrophy block, you'll notice fatigue accumulates. You're not necessarily more fresh from each workout to workout. You're fighting fatigue. You're just trying to get the minimum amount of homework in and hoping that you can last through the next one. So we're building up fatigue as time goes on. So it's over the entire cycle that we're looking for this adaptive process to occur. And it's really only when we switch gears, when we either deload or drop that training stimulus and build back up, that recovery is allowed. One of the reasons I like block periodization schemes and linear schemes is because it capitalizes on the fact that if you don't do something for a period of time, you resensitize yourself to it. So it makes it very easy to schedule these short runs where we hyperfixate on a rep threshold or a volume threshold we're not used to. We flesh it out, we can tangibly see the improvement over those weeks, and then just before we hit that brick wall, which remember, you hit brick walls a lot quicker when you're more advanced than when you're newer. So just before we hit that brick wall, we either switch gears or we deload. And that's the recovery component. That's what allows us to keep going. So I like to ebb and flow back and forth between different thresholds, and it makes it very easy. If I just peaked for a meet, I just hit a 1 rep max, going into the meet, I peaked because I took all of the work down to lower fatigue. I jacked the weights up really high, and I made sure I was as recovered as humanly possible. Well, when fatigue doesn't accumulate, fitness drops, your capacity drops. So at a time where I'm absolutely the strongest going into a meet, I'm gonna realize that I'm also not really conditioned to volume. I'm not conditioned to doing 8s, 10s, and 12s. So coming back into it, I know that it's gonna suck the first week, but every single week I'm going to fill out those 10s and I'm going to see myself improve. So I want you to think about that principle as you think about what you're doing right now for your programming. If you are in a volume phase, are you taking your 8s and 10s seriously? Are you really focused on trying to get better at not just the rep range, but the amount of work you're doing to get better with regards to lasting through a very long, laborious workout? A lot of you guys tend to put the things you don't want to do on the back burner, which means you're only really applying yourself to the heavy weights when they come around. But if you're not taking those other thresholds seriously, you're not going to be able to stack those SRA curves together and really realize long-term growth. A perfect example is this volumizing cycle I had my guys do recently, where we go from 3, we actually start at 10s, we go from 3x10 to 4x10 to 5x10, and then we repeat 3x8, 4x8, 5x8. And it's a very productive way, even with the compound movements, of building this volume base. For one, you don't kill yourself with the most amount of volume on the first week. You actually give yourself a few weeks to adapt to it. But you feel each workout that goes by, you get a little better, you last a little longer, you aren't so miserable. But the key thing here is that we're not trying to jack the weight up. We're just focused on volume. That's the threshold. We're focused on an amount of work we do at that specific rep range. And by the end, you notice that you last a lot longer. You notice it's not as terrible. And then when you drop the sets and you make that jump, that quantum leap into that next heavy range, you notice that everything feels way better. And you're actually surprised to see the strength that you've gained without actually having to prioritize weight. So I had them do that for squats and deadlifts. I had to tell them till I was blue in the face, don't jack the weight up, don't jack the weight up, don't jack the weight up. They kept the weight down. They just fixated on adding that extra set. And from all the crying and sobbing I had to hear on week 1, by week 2, they were citing how much better the workout went, how much better they felt. And I made that a teachable moment. That is exactly what you should be experiencing in these phases. This is how you know you're on track. That represents a tangible sign of improvement without having to go hit a new 1 rep max to make sure you've gotten stronger. So it seems to be the real important thing as you get stronger for long-term growth is to really just recognize the role of stagnation and recovery. It's not even so much the linearity, it's the fact that you are taking time away from the same hard, heavy efforts and letting yourself adjust to a different threshold. It's the ebbing and flowing back and forth that keeps you going. So this is how I like to think of it. There's different ways to organize it, but if we're looking at difficulty, every block you do each week should not be as equally as difficult. There's an arrangement. Now, sometimes it's a little more jumbled, but I like to go from easier to harder and then back off and repeat. It just makes more sense. So if this is a volume run, I'm building up in volume before I move into a different threshold. And as I drop the volume down and build back up, that represents a period of recovery that allows me to adapt. It allows me to realize that strength from the stress I put on myself on the first block. If this is intensification, if I'm focused on adding weight, that means I'm getting into heavier percentages that I haven't experienced recently. And eventually, because it's not sustainable to keep going up, I have to drop back down, train a different threshold, or drop down and build back up. There are too many ways to apply these principles to your training to even count. So I know it's going to be difficult to take this and draw something up from scratch, but like I said, if you're writing out your own stuff or if you're following somebody else's stuff, you should be able to start to pick apart how these principles realize themselves in that written program. And it should give you some insight on how to manipulate your programming later on. Remember, it's not just about every workout being a bloodbath. There has to be an order and a structure to this, and your progress has to be predictable. If you can't look ahead in a program and mathematically see how the stress is going to improve over time or where the periods of recovery are, that means there's something wrong with the program. So thanks for watching, guys. Go ahead and take questions and comments to the comment section or take them to empire-forum.com. Until next time, this is Bromley from Empire Barbell. I'll see you.